The card reader flashed red 3 times, and in that small mechanical refusal, I understood that everything I had spent 41 years building had already been taken from me. It was 6 in the morning. The lobby of my own company was still dark except for the security desk, and the badge in my hand, the one with my name embossed on it, the one that had opened every door in that building since the day we poured the foundation, had just been rejected by a machine that cost less than the coffee maker in my office. I tried again, read again, read. Behind me, the night guard cleared his throat the way people do when they already know something you don't, and are ashamed to be the one holding it. 12 hours earlier, I had buried my wife of 39 years. 9 hours earlier, my son's wife had slid a folder across my dining room table, still warm from the printer, and told me it was time to sign. If stories about family, betrayal, and the long patience it takes to make things right are the kind of thing that keeps you listening, take a moment to subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications. What comes next took me 6 weeks to survive and the better part of a year to understand. Let me go back. Eleanor died on a Tuesday in March in a room at Charlotte Mercy Hospital that smelled of antiseptic and the lilies I kept replacing, because she said the room felt too much like a room. Pancreatic cancer. 11 months from diagnosis to the last breath, which the doctors told me was longer than most, and which felt to me like 11 minutes. She was 71. She had a laugh that started low in her chest and arrived late, like she had to consider the joke first and decide it was worth the trouble. She kept a ledger in her purse for 30 years, a real one, paper columns in her small square handwriting, long after we had accountants and software and a finance department. She said numbers on a screen were a rumor. Numbers in ink were a fact. In 1985, we bought a used freight truck with $11,000, most of it borrowed from her father, who did not like me and made sure I knew it. She rode with me on the first 6 runs because we could not afford a second driver and because she did not trust me to eat. By 1994, we had 9 trucks. By 2006, we had a terminal off the interstate, a dispatch floor, and 140 employees, whose names Eleanor knew, along with the names of their children. Weston Freight Group, $15 million in assets, the last time anyone bothered to add it up. We built it out of nothing, and she is the reason there is a we in that sentence at all. The morning after the funeral, I stood in my kitchen at 5:40 and could not remember what I had come in there to do. That is the thing nobody warns you about. Not the grief. Everyone warns you about the grief. Nobody warns you about the small administrative collapse of a life, the way you find yourself holding a coffee filter with no memory of the intention that put it in your hand. That was when Renee let herself in through the side door. My daughter-in-law had a key because Eleanor had given her one 4 years ago in a gesture of trust that I had thought at the time was generous and that I have since come to understand was simply my wife being who she was. Renee did not say she was sorry. I want to be precise about this because in the months afterward I turned that morning over and over like a stone in my pocket, looking for a version of it in which she said the thing a person says. She did not. She set her handbag on the counter, looked at the unwashed dishes in my sink with an expression she did not bother to hide, and said, "Harold, we need to talk about the transition." The transition. As though Eleanor had been a fiscal quarter. She took a folder out of the handbag. Emergency transfer of executive authority, it said across the top, in the kind of font that is meant to look inevitable. 22 pages, tabs where I was to sign, ranged in advance, little colored flags like a child's craft project. The recipient of that authority, according to page 4, was to be Mason, my grandson, 18 years old. A boy who had wrecked 2 vehicles in 3 years, who had been asked not to return to a private school in Raleigh for reasons the family had agreed never to discuss, and whose sole demonstrated interest in the freight business was the company card he used at restaurants in South End. "Mason isn't ready to run a lemonade stand," I said. "Mason has a name that means something," Renee said. "And you're 74, and you've just lost your wife, and honestly, Harold, you look like you haven't slept in a year. Nobody's saying you did anything wrong. We're saying you're tired. Trevor and I will handle the operational side. Mason just needs to be on the paper." There it was. Mason just needs to be on the paper. I have negotiated with Teamsters, with fuel brokers during the 2008 spike, with a district attorney once over a driver who had made a bad decision at a way station. I know the sound of a sentence that has been rehearsed. That one had been said out loud, Probably more than once, probably to a mirror. I'll think about it, I said. Trevor arrived 40 minutes later, and I have wondered since whether he had been sitting in his car down the block, waiting for a text that said the old man is softening. My son came in with his hands already open, palms up, the posture of a man surrendering to a conversation he had not yet had. He is 44 years old, he has his mother's eyes and none of her spine. Dad. He sat across from me. I know how this looks. Do you? Renee's blunt, she's always been blunt. But she's not wrong about the timing. He turned his coffee cup a quarter turn, and then another quarter turn, and did not drink from it. The board's going to start asking questions about continuity. If we get ahead of it, we control the story. If we don't. Continuity, I said. Your mother has been dead for 31 hours. He flinched. I'll give him that much. He flinched. Some part of my son was still in there, buried under 20 years of accommodations, and it registered the obscenity of what he was doing. It just wasn't strong enough to stop him. I'm worried about you, he said. That's all this is. And that, more than the folder, more than Renee's face at my sink, was the moment something in me went very quiet and very cold. Because he was lying, and he was bad at it, and he was my son, and I could see the exact place where the lie was seamed together. I walked them out. At the door, Renee turned back toward the hall mirror to adjust her collar, and in that mirror, she did not think about the mirror. They never do. I watched her thumbs move across her phone screen, and I watched her mouth make the shape of a smile that had nothing to do with grief. I could not read the message. I did not need to. I have watched people close deals for 4 decades, and there is a particular smile that belongs more to a person who believes they have just closed one. That night I did not sleep. I sat in Eleanor's chair, which still held the shape of her, and I thought about the ledger in her purse. Numbers in ink are a fact. I decided I would go look at some facts, which brings us back to the card reader. 3 red flashes. The guard behind me clearing his throat, and then the sound of dress shoes on polished concrete, moving toward me at an hour when nobody should have been in that building. Gregory Pruitt had been our chief financial officer for 11 years. He was a tall, careful man who wore his hair short and his opinions shorter, and he had a habit of arriving at meetings 4 minutes early so that he could be seated when you walked in. Eleanor never liked him. She never said why. When I pressed her, she would say only that he watched the room, and when I asked what that meant, she said, "Everyone watches the room, Harold, but he takes attendance." "Harold," he said it warmly, "I didn't expect to see you here. I imagine not. There was a security protocol update yesterday afternoon. Credential tiers, access logs, the whole architecture. Trevor authorized it. He tilted his head, sympathetic. Given that you'll be on extended leave, we tiered your badge down to visitor status. Temporarily. It's a compliance thing. We can't have active executive credentials assigned to someone who isn't in the building daily. Auditors flag it. Extended leave. Nobody had told me I was on extended leave. Here is what I want you to understand, and it is the only piece of advice in this entire story that I would give to a person my age with something worth taking. The instinct in that moment is to raise your voice. To say, "Do you know who I am?" To demand the guard call someone. To make the size of your anger match the size of the theft. Do not do that. Anger is information. Every time you spend it in public, you hand somebody a free look at what you know and how much it hurts. I had a nephew once who lost a $180,000 lawsuit because he could not stop talking in a deposition. So I smiled at Gregory Pruitt and I said, "That's sensible. Trevor's got a good head for compliance." Something crossed his face. Not suspicion, something smaller. Disappointment, I think, that the scene he had prepared for was not going to happen. "I'll walk you out," he said. He walked me out of my own building at 6:15 in the morning, past the wall where Eleanor's photograph hung with the other founders, and I let him, and I said nothing. And I got into my truck and drove to the far end of the lot and sat there until my hands stopped shaking. Then I drove to the storage unit I have rented in Pineville since 2014, under a name that is legally mine, but that nobody in my family has ever heard me use, and I opened a fireproof box, and I took out an external drive. I want to be careful here because I know how this sounds. I did not plant a secret weapon in my own company. What I did was much more boring, and any founder listening to this will recognize it. In 2016, when we migrated our operations and finance systems onto a single platform, I insisted that the archive layer retain a read-only mirror, a full copy of transaction logs, signature records, and access history, physically separate from the live system, updating on a scheduled pull. Our IT director thought I was paranoid. I told him I had watched a competitor lose 4 years of records to a ransomware crew, out of nowhere, and I was never going to be in that position. It was a backup, that is all it ever was. But a backup is also a record. And a record is a thing that people who are stealing from you do not know you have. I drove home with that drive on the passenger seat, and I was pulling into my driveway when my phone rang, and the screen said Charlotte Mercy Hospital, and every cell in my body went to ice. Because that is where my wife had died 11 days earlier, and I did not think that number could ever bring me anything again. Mason had put a motorcycle into a guardrail on Providence Road at 11 the night before. He was alive. That was the first thing the nurse said, and the only thing that mattered for about 90 seconds. Compound fracture of the left femur, 2 broken ribs, significant internal bleeding, surgery already underway. They had called me because I was listed as an emergency contact on a form somebody had filled out years ago and never updated. I drove to that hospital doing 60 in a 45, and I did not think once about folders or badges or Gregory Pruitt. Whatever else that boy was, spoiled, aimless, raised by people who had taught him that consequences were something that happened to other families. He was 18 years old, and he was in an operating room. I had taught him to drive a stick shift in an empty lot off Tyvola when he was 15. He had laughed so hard when he stalled it the 4th time that he had to put his head on the wheel. Renee was in the surgical waiting area. She was on the phone. I heard the end of her sentence as I came around the corner, and I have never been able to unhear it. No, Friday still works. This doesn't change Friday. She saw me and ended the call. I stood there in a hallway that smelled like my wife's last 11 months, and I looked at a woman who had just been told her only child was on a table with his leg opened up, and what she was managing was a calendar. He's stable, she said. They think. Trevor came up from the parking deck a few minutes later, gray-faced, and for once I believed his distress. Whatever my son is, he loves that boy. That turned out to matter enormously, though not in the way I expected. At around 4 in the afternoon, a surgical resident came out to find us. She was maybe 30, exhausted, holding a tablet. He's out of surgery. He's in recovery. The femur is pinned. He lost a lot of blood. We've transfused 4 units, and we may need more overnight. Are any of you Abe positive? We're not short, but we like to know what's in the family in case. And the world stopped. I want to slow down here, because this is the hinge on which my entire life turned, and I have had 2 years to think about how to explain it clearly. I am blood type O. I have known this since 1971 when the Army told me, and I have given blood roughly 90 times since, because when you are O, you get phone calls. Eleanor was O as well. She knew it because of a scare during her first pregnancy, and she used to joke that between the 2 of us, we were the least interesting couple in the county, biologically speaking. Universal donors, nothing to give but the basics. 2 parents who are type O can only produce a child who is type O. There is no other outcome. The O allele is recessive. If both parents carry nothing else, there is nothing else to pass down. So Trevor is type O, he has to be. That is not an opinion or a probability, that is arithmetic. Renee is type A. I knew this because 4 years earlier she had made a small performance out of a blood drive at the company and had mentioned her type twice. A parent who is type O and a parent who is type A cannot, under any circumstance recognized by human biology, produce a child who is type AB. Not rarely. Not 1 time in 10,000. Never. I stood in that hallway with my hand on a wall, and I did the math 3 times, looking for the error, wanting the error, and there was no error. Then I looked at my son. Trevor was not looking at the doctor. He was not looking at his wife. He was looking at the floor, and his jaw was working, and his face had gone the specific shade of a man who has just heard a door open behind him that he has spent 18 years assuming was locked. He knew. That was the thing that took my legs out from under me, not the fact itself, but his face. Whatever the truth was, my son was not learning it in that hallway. He was only learning that I might. I found him in the cafeteria an hour later, sitting alone in front of a coffee he had not touched. A positive, I said, sitting down. Dad, you and I are both O. Renee's A. Run it for me. Show me the version where that works. For a moment he did not answer, and in that moment I saw him choose. I watched my son stand at a fork in his own life for the 2nd or 3rd time and take the same road he had taken every time before. Labs make mistakes, he said. You know how many errors happen in intake? They probably typed it wrong, or you're misremembering mom's type. She was sick a long time, Dad. There were a lot of charts. I gave blood at the terminal in October. Your mother's type is on her donor card in my wallet. Then maybe you're wrong about your own. He raised his voice slightly, and two people at the next table looked over, and he lowered it again. You're 74, you just lost your wife, you haven't slept. And now you're doing genetics in a hospital cafeteria about my son, because a resident asked a routine question. There it was, the pivot, not a denial, an attack on the instrument. If the man is unreliable, the measurement is unreliable. You're right, I said. I'm tired. I'm not thinking straight. The relief came off him like heat off asphalt. It's okay. It's been a brutal month. It has. I stood up. I put my hand on his shoulder and I felt him relax under it, and that is the last piece of physical affection I have ever given my son. Get some rest, Trevor. I'll be back in the morning. He smiled at me. He thought he had gotten away with it. Here is what he had actually done. Before that conversation, I had a mathematical impossibility and a bad feeling. After it, I had something much more useful. I had confirmation that my son would lie to my face about it, immediately, fluently, without hesitation. A man who is confused defends the facts. A man who is complicit defends the framing. I drove home and I didn't sleep, and at some point around 2 in the morning, I stopped being a grieving husband and became something else. Something older and more patient. I built a company from a used truck and a borrowed $11,000. And you do not do that by being kind. You do that by being able to sit still with a bad situation for as long as it takes to see all of it. I needed 3 things. Proof of what Mason was. Proof of what they were doing to the company. And I needed both before Friday, because Friday apparently still worked. 2 days later, I made soup. That is not a euphemism. I made a large pot of chicken and rice soup, the way Eleanor made it, badly because she had never written the recipe down, and I was working from the memory of watching her, and I put it in a container and I drove to my son's house in Myers Park with it on the floorboard. Renee answered the door and could not have been more surprised if I had arrived on horseback. I thought you all could use something that wasn't takeout, I said. How's he doing? They let me in, because what else do you do? Mason was home from the hospital, propped up in the den with his leg in an external fixator, playing something on a screen and looking very young. I sat with him for 20 minutes. He told me about the accident in a way that carefully avoided the word speed. I told him about the time I put my father's Ford into a fence post in 1968. He laughed and it hurt his ribs, and he laughed again anyway. I loved him in that moment, and I want to say that plainly, because what I did next was calculated and cold, and I have never once pretended otherwise. On my way out, I asked to use the bathroom. The upstairs hall bath is the one Mason uses. His electric toothbrush was in a cup by the sink, the head still damp. I put it in a paper sandwich bag from my jacket pocket. In the front hall, on the shoulder of Trevor's gray wool coat hanging by the door, there were 4 or 5 hairs, dark, and I took 3 of them with a pair of tweezers and put them in a second bag. I have thought a great deal about whether I had the right to do that. Here is where I landed, and you are welcome to disagree with me. I was not investigating a private citizen out of curiosity. I was the sole trustee of an estate governed by a specific instrument my wife had written, and I had encountered credible evidence that the instrument was being defrauded. I also had, sitting in my own driveway, 22 pages designed to transfer control of 140 people's livelihoods on the basis of a bloodline claim I now had reason to believe was false. I did not take that toothbrush to satisfy a suspicion. I took it because I was about to be asked to sign something, and a man who signs without verifying is not innocent. He is only lazy. That night I drove 90 minutes to a private forensic laboratory outside Greensboro that advertises expedited paternity and kinship analysis. I paid in cash, a little under $2,000 for the rush service, not the $5,000 I had braced for, and I filled out a form that asked me to affirm I had a lawful right to submit the samples, and I signed it, and I have made my peace with that signature. The technician told me 48 to 72 hours, which left me 2 days with nothing to do but look at what was on that external drive. And that, it turned out, was where the real story was. I am not a forensic accountant. I want to be honest about my limitations, because I think stories like mine often make the narrator sound cleverer than he was, and that does a disservice to anybody listening who is actually in trouble. What I am is a man who signed every check at his own company for 22 years, before we got large enough that I stopped, and who therefore knows what our money is supposed to look like when it moves. I started with the vendor payment register, because that is where money hides. Not in payroll, which everyone examines, and not in capital expenditure, which requires board approval. It hides in the boring middle, the maintenance contracts, the consulting retainers, the logistics optimization services that sound like something a freight company would obviously need. It took me most of a day to find the first one. Meridian Corridor Analytics, incorporated in Delaware, retained for network efficiency consulting at $18,000 a month, beginning in April of the previous year. April, the month Eleanor was diagnosed. I sat back in my chair and I felt something I had not felt yet in that entire month, which was rage. Real rage, the kind that arrives in the body before the mind. Because I understood immediately what April meant. They had not waited for her to die. They had started while she was still going to her first appointments, while I was still learning the word unresectable, while every ounce of my attention was pointed at a hospital room. They had used my wife's cancer as cover. By midnight I had 4 of them. Meridian Corridor Analytics, Ashford Root Systems, Piedmont Load Advisory, Carolina Interlink Consulting, all Delaware, all incorporated within a 9-week window. All billing monthly, none for enough to trigger the $50,000 threshold that requires a second signature under our own internal controls. Which told me something important, because the $50,000 threshold is not public information. It is in our finance policy manual. Whoever built this had read it. Total outflow across 15 months, a little over $4,100,000. Then I found the transfer. $440,000 moved 8 days earlier, 3 days before Eleanor's funeral, from the company's operating account into a 5th entity I had not seen before. And the authorization on it carried my electronic signature, my signature, on a transfer I had never seen, executed on a day I spent choosing a casket. This is the detail I want to dwell on, because it is the detail that saved me. Our system, like most systems of its kind, records 2 separate things for every authorization. It records the signature credential that was applied, and it records the session log, which device, which network, which physical badge access, what time. On the live system, an administrator with sufficient privileges can amend records. On my read-only archive mirror, nobody can amend anything, because there is nothing to amend it with. The signature said Harold Weston, 9:14 a.m. The session log said the credential had been applied from a workstation on the 3rd floor, the finance floor, on a device registered to the office of the chief financial officer. At 9:14 that morning, my badge had not entered the building at all. I was, at 9:14 that morning, at Carruthers Funeral Home on East Boulevard, and I could prove it because I had signed a physical contract there, and the funeral director had dated it. They had my credential. They did not have my body, and they had never thought about the difference. And then, sitting there at 2 in the morning with a legal pad full of numbers, I finally understood the folder. Renee's 22 pages were not a power grab. I had been reading them as greed, and greed was only the surface. The transfer of executive authority did 2 things. It moved Mason into nominal control and, buried on page 19 in the indemnification language, it affirmed that all financial authorizations executed under my credential through the date of transfer were valid, authorized, and my responsibility. Our external audit cycle begins the 2nd week of August. They were not trying to take my company. They were trying to make me the man who stole from it. Friday still works, she had said. I looked at the calendar on my wall. It was Wednesday. The laboratory called on Thursday morning at 9:40. Probability of biological grandparent relationship, 0. Not low, not inconclusive. The report used a phrase I have not been able to forget. Excluded across all tested loci, which is the scientific way of saying that whatever Mason is, he is not made of anything I gave the world. I said thank you. I asked them to send the certified copy by courier. I hung up the phone and I sat in my kitchen for a long time. I did not feel triumphant. I want to say that clearly, because I think people expect this part of the story to feel like a victory, and it did not. I had just been handed a piece of paper proving that a boy I taught to drive a stick shift was not my blood. And the first thought I had, the very first one, was that I was going to have to tell him. Then I called a man named Dominic Reyes. Dominic had done contract work for us twice. Once on a cargo theft ring at the Greensboro terminal, once on a workers' compensation claim that turned out to be legitimate, which he told me plainly even though I was paying him and would have preferred otherwise. That is why I called him. A man who tells you the answer you did not buy is the only kind worth hiring. I gave him 3 names in a week. He needed 4 days. What he brought me on Monday afternoon, in a manila envelope on my back porch, rearranged 20 years of my life. Renee and Gregory Pruitt had met at the University of South Carolina in 2001. They had dated for 2 years. There were photographs, a fraternity formal, a spring break, the ordinary archaeology of a young relationship. That in itself was not a crime. Charlotte is not a large city and people have histories. The rest of it was. Dominic had built a timeline out of things that are, individually, meaningless. A recurring monthly hotel charge on a card in Gregory's name, always the same property in Ballantyne, always the second Thursday. A lease on a condominium in Dilworth, held by a Delaware LLC whose registered agent matched one of the 4 shell entities. Travel that overlapped across 11 business trips in 6 years, including 2 that Gregory had submitted expense reports for, and one that Renee had told Trevor was a women's retreat in Asheville. The pattern went back at least 9 years. Dominic's professional assessment, which he was careful to frame as an assessment, was that it had likely never fully stopped since college. 20 years, through a wedding I paid for, through a child, through 11 years during which I promoted Gregory Pruitt twice and once gave him a bonus for loyalty. And Mason had been born in the fall of 2007, 8 months after Trevor and Renee's wedding, and I had made a joke about it at the time, the kind of joke fathers make, and Trevor had laughed too hard. There was one more thing in that envelope, and it is the thing that ended any possibility of mercy for my son. Dominic had, through means he described to me in general terms, and which I believe were within the law, obtained a printed email. It was dated November of 2007, 19 years ago, 5 weeks before Mason was born. It was from Trevor to a private address. It had been printed, at the time, on a home printer, and it had survived in a box of documents that Renee's mother had kept, and that Dominic had gotten access to, through a route that involved an estate sale and a great deal of patience. I am not going to reproduce it. It is my son's shame, and I have chosen not to hand it around. What it said, in substance, was this. Trevor had been diagnosed with non-obstructive azoospermia in the summer of 2007. He was, and had always been, unable to father a child. He knew the baby was not his. He knew from context exactly whose it likely was, and he had decided, the email argues this at length, to himself as much as to anyone, that the alternative was worse. Because Eleanor's trust instrument, drafted in 1998, restricted principal distribution to lineal descendants by blood, and a divorce with no heir would have left him with a salary and nothing else. My son had known for 19 years that his wife's child belonged to his wife's lover, and he had done the arithmetic, and he had decided that a lifetime of humiliation was an acceptable price for staying in the will. I read that email 4 times. Then I went out to the garage where Eleanor's ledger books are, and I sat on the concrete floor among boxes of a dead woman's careful handwriting, and I cried for about 20 minutes, not for the company, not for the money, and not even for the betrayal. For Trevor, for the boy who had stalled a truck in a parking lot in 1997 and laughed until he cried. Somewhere between that afternoon and this one, my son had traded himself away in pieces, and nobody had made him do it, and he had gotten so little for it. Then I stood up and I washed my face and I called my attorney. Elijah Adeyemi had handled Weston Freight's legal work for 16 years. His parents had come from Lagos in 1979 and had put 3 children through school in Durham on a pharmacist's salary and a night job, and Elijah had the particular quality that produces. He was never in a hurry, and he never lost anything. He came to my house on a Tuesday, and I put the whole of it on my dining room table. The lab report, the 4 shell entities, the transfer with my signature and the session log that contradicted it, Dominic's timeline. The email he read for 2 hours without speaking. Then he took off his glasses. "Harold," he said, "I need you to understand something before we go further. If we do this correctly, you don't get to have a family afterward." I noticed. No, listen to me. Because I have watched clients make this exact decision, and half of them come back to me in 3 years and ask if it can be undone. He tapped the email. "This can be handled quietly. You could take this to Trevor privately, force a resignation, restructure the trust, recover what's recoverable through civil action, and nobody ever goes to prison. It costs you money, and it costs you time, and your grandson never learns what he is. That is a real option, and it is not a cowardly one. I thought about it. I want the record to show that I actually thought about it. There are 140 people at that company, I said. How much of that 4 million came out of the retirement plan? Elijah put his glasses back on. That's the other thing I need to show you. 2 of the 4 shell entities had been billing against an account line that carried a portion of the employer contribution to our employee retirement plan. Not the whole thing, they were not that stupid, but a slice disguised as an administrative servicing fee running quietly for 15 months. Which is what took it out of my hands entirely. A man can decide to forgive a theft from himself. He does not get to forgive a theft from Charlene in dispatch, who has been with us since 1996, or from Ray Okonkwo, who drives the Atlanta lane and has 3 kids and a mortgage. Then we don't do it quietly, I said. No, Elijah agreed. We don't. He made the call that afternoon. Federal jurisdiction attaches when a retirement plan is involved, and it attaches hard. Special Agent Lisa Monroe came to Elijah's office 3 days later with a colleague from the Department of Labor's Employee Benefits Security Administration, and she listened to the entire thing without once interrupting. And at the end, she asked me one question that I thought was very intelligent. Mr. Weston, have you been asked to sign anything? Friday, I said. 9 a.m. full board at the company. She looked at Elijah. Elijah looked at me. Would you be willing, she said, to attend that meeting? Now, I need to correct something, because I have heard versions of stories like mine where the narrator describes himself directing federal agents like a chess grandmaster. And that is not what happened, and I would be lying if I let you believe it. I did not run that operation. I was not consulted on strategy. What I was told plainly was this. The investigation would proceed on its own timeline, which would be months, not days. Nothing about Friday was going to produce arrests, and my only role was to not sign the document, to say nothing that would compromise the case, and to allow the board meeting to happen so that the record would show what it showed. What I asked for was one thing. I asked that Elijah be allowed to present the trust documentation and the DNA finding at that meeting as a matter of corporate governance entirely separate from the federal investigation, because the board had a fiduciary right to know that the succession instrument in front of them was void on its face. Agent Monroe said that was between me and my lawyer, so that is what we did. On Wednesday night, I called Trevor and told him, in a voice I made small and tired on purpose, that he was right, that I was 74 and exhausted and could not carry it anymore, and that I would sign on Friday in front of the board so that it would all be clean and public and nobody could ever question it later. He was so relieved that he cried. I could hear it. That is the part of this I would take back if I could take back any of it. Not the FBI, not the lab, that phone call, using my son's guilt about his father against him one last time to make him easy to handle. I am not proud of it, but I am not going to lie to you about it either. Friday, 9 in the morning. The conference room on the 4th floor with the long walnut table, Eleanor picked out in 2009, and the window that looks north toward the interstate, where our trucks go out. They had already seated themselves when I arrived. Renee was in the chair at the head of the table. My chair. She had put a leather portfolio in front of her and a fountain pen beside it, and she had dressed for the photograph she expected somebody to take. Trevor was to her right, looking like a man who had not eaten. Gregory Pruitt was at the far end with a stack of folders squared to the table edge. 7 board members, 2 outside directors, our corporate secretary with a laptop open for minutes. Mason was not there. He was at home with a pinned femur, and I was glad, and I remain glad. Harold. Renee did not stand up, take a seat anywhere. In a room I paid for, at a table I bought, in a building with my wife's photograph on the 2nd floor. I sat halfway down, and I folded my hands, and I said nothing. She ran the meeting. She actually ran it. Called it to order, referenced an agenda, spoke about continuity and market confidence and the importance of a clear signal to our lenders. She had done homework. I will grant her that. Whatever else Renee is, she is not lazy. And then, 6 minutes in, she made the mistake that people like her always make, which is that she could not resist the pleasure of it. I know this is difficult for Harold, she said to the room, about me while I was in it. And I want to acknowledge Eleanor. She was a wonderful woman, very traditional, very much of her generation. She never really understood the business side. She was more of a presence, and I think there's been an emotional attachment to that era that's held this company back for a long time. 3 of the board members looked at the table. Eleanor Weston, who ran our books by hand until 2003, who negotiated the Greensboro terminal lease herself, who once drove a load to Norfolk at 59 years old because a driver's wife went into labor and there was nobody else. More of a presence. I did not move. But something in me settled, finally and completely, and whatever small residual part of me had been hoping there was a version of this, where I did not have to go all the way. That part closed its eyes and went to sleep. "Well," Renee said, sliding the portfolio down the table toward me. "Shall we?" I opened it. 22 pages. The colored flags. Page 19, with its indemnification language, right where I had left it in my own copy at home. I took the fountain pen. I turned it over in my fingers. Then I set it down on the table, closed the portfolio, and said no. The room went very still. "Harold," I said no. "And before anyone speaks, my attorney is in the lobby and he's been waiting 11 minutes. Madam Secretary, please note in the minutes that I've asked that he be admitted." Elijah came in with a banker's box. What happened over the next 35 minutes was not dramatic in the way I had imagined it would be during all those nights I could not sleep. It was procedural, it was almost boring, and that is precisely why it was total. He began with the trust. He put the 1998 instrument on the table and read the restriction on principal distribution to lineal descendants by blood, and then he read the corresponding provision in the succession agreement in front of the board, which explicitly represented Mason Weston as a lineal descendant and made that representation a condition of the agreement's validity. Then he put down the certified laboratory report, excluded across all tested loci, he read. The agreement before this board void ab initio. Not voidable, void. It represents a material fact that is false, and every director who votes for it today is voting on a document with a known defect in the record. Gregory Pruitt said, "That test is inadmissible." He obtained those samples, and then he stopped, because he had just told a room full of people that he knew exactly whose samples they were, and why the result mattered to him personally, before anyone had said a word about him at all. Elijah did not even look up. "Second item," he said. He laid out the 4 Delaware entities. He laid out the payment register. He laid out the $440,000 transfer with my credential on it, and beside it the session log from the archive mirror, showing the device, the floor, and the badge access record. And beside that, a photocopy of a funeral home contract signed in my hand and dated at 9:20 that same morning, 6 miles away. "Mr. Weston did not authorize this transfer," Elijah said. "Mr. Weston was burying his wife. The credential was applied from a workstation registered to the office of the chief financial officer. Every head in that room turned toward the far end of the table. I watched Renee's face then, and I have thought about it many times since. She did not look at Gregory. She looked at Trevor. And in about a second and a half, I watched 20 years of a marriage that was never a marriage complete its final transaction, as she calculated exactly how much of this could be made to belong to my son. Trevor handles the operational authorizations, she said. That was all. 5 words. 19 years of a shared lie, and when the floor came up she reached for him without hesitation. My son laughed. It was a terrible sound. Say it again, he said to her. Say it again, Renee. Tell them who handles the authorizations. Trevor. Tell them about Ballantyne. He was crying now and shouting, and the corporate secretary had stopped typing. Tell them about the second Thursday. 19 years and you. He turned to Gregory Pruitt. You sat in my house. At Christmas. You bought my son a bicycle. Your son, Gregory said quietly. And I would think very carefully about the next thing you say. There was a sound from the board members then, a low collective intake, because that sentence had a shape to it that everyone in the room recognized. I stood up. That's enough, I said. And the room, out of 41 years of habit, went quiet for me. Nobody was arrested that morning. I want to keep saying that, because the version of this story that ends with handcuffs in the boardroom is a better story, and it is not the true one. What happened that morning was a vote. The board removed Gregory Pruitt as chief financial officer, effective immediately, for cause. It removed Trevor Weston as chief operating officer, effective immediately, for cause. It voted to preserve all records and to cooperate fully with any external inquiry. It reinstated my executive authority, which the outside counsel present observed had never been validly suspended in the first place, since the security reclassification had been executed without board action. Gregory Pruitt walked out of that building at 10:15 in the morning, carrying nothing. escorted by the same security team that had escorted me 19 days earlier, past the same wall with my wife's photograph on it. The arrests came in November. 14 months after that, in a federal courtroom on West Trade Street, Renee Weston and Gregory Pruitt pleaded guilty to wire fraud and to theft from an employee benefit plan. She received 78 months. He received 92, having also been found to have falsified records after the fact. There were forfeiture orders. There is a restitution schedule that will outlive all three of us. Trevor was not charged. The government concluded, correctly, I believe, that he had been a signature, not an architect, and that he had not known where the money went. He testified. He was, by all accounts, a truthful witness, which is the first thing my son had been in a very long time. But the trust is a separate matter from the criminal one, and I am the trustee. I removed him. Every distribution, every contingent interest, the house in Myers Park that the trust held title to, the vehicle, the health coverage, all of it. I did it with Elijah at my kitchen table on a Thursday afternoon, initialing each page, and it took 40 minutes, and it was the coldest thing I have ever done. He came to see me about it. He stood on my porch and he did not ask for the money back. He asked me whether I had ever, at any point in the last 19 years, suspected. I told him the truth, which was no. He nodded and he said, then I was good at something, and he walked back to his car. He works at a distribution warehouse in Gastonia now, on second shift. I know this because I make it my business to know. He has an apartment. He has not asked me for anything, not once, and I do not know what to do with that. And then there was Mason. I drove to the house in Myers Park in August, before the trust took it, and I sat in the den with a boy in a leg brace whose mother was under federal indictment, and whose father had moved out, and whose entire understanding of himself had been demolished in a single summer. He knew by then. Somebody had told him, I still do not know who, and he had not slept properly in weeks. Are you here to tell me I'm not a Weston, he said. No, I said, you already know that. I'm here to tell you what happens next. I had thought very hard about what to say to him, and I got most of it wrong, and I have made my peace with that too. But I got one part right, and it is the only part that has mattered. I told him that the trust was closed to him, and that this was not negotiable and not cruelty. It was simply what the document said. And the document had been written by a woman who had earned the right to say what happened to what she built. Then I told him that I had opened a separate account, funded personally, not from the trust and not from the company, that would carry his tuition, books, and housing at a state university for 4 years, contingent on nothing except enrollment and passing grades. He asked me why. Because you were 8 years old, I said. And because whatever your mother did, she did not do it to you. And I am not going to be the fourth adult in your life to decide you're an inconvenience. He asked me if I was still his grandfather. And I told him the truth, which was that I did not know. That blood had turned out to be a smaller thing than I had spent 74 years assuming, and paperwork had turned out to be a smaller thing still, and that the only category I had left was the one where a person shows up on a Tuesday for no reason and keeps doing it for a decade, until it means something. So show up, I said, and we'll find out. He is 19 now. He is at UNC Charlotte studying supply chain management, which I did not ask him to do. He calls on Sundays. He is not very good at it yet, neither am I. The retirement plan was made whole in the first week of December. Not by the restitution schedule, which moves at the speed of the federal government, but by me, out of the sale of a piece of land off Highway 74 that Eleanor and I had bought in 1991 and never done anything with. $4,112,000, plus the returns those accounts would have earned. It went in as a single employer contribution, and the plan administrator asked me 3 times whether I understood I would not be getting it back. I also went and found 4 people. In the 18 months before all of this, Gregory Pruitt had eliminated 4 positions in the accounting department. I had signed off on it at the time. Cost discipline, he called it. It was not cost discipline. Each of those 4 people had at some point asked a question about a vendor invoice. One of them had taken a job at half the salary. One had moved to Tennessee. One was retired and did not want to come back, and told me so pleasantly, and told me some other things less pleasantly, and was right about all of it. The 4th, a woman named Cheryl who had been with us 9 years, came back as controller, and has since found 2 more things I had missed. In March, on the anniversary, I signed the last document. 50% of my holding in Weston Freight Group went into an employee stock ownership plan. Every driver, every dispatcher, every mechanic in the shop. The other 50% capitalizes the Eleanor Weston Scholarship Fund, which pays full tuition for the children of freight and logistics workers in the Carolinas. Not our employees only. Anybody's. 41 awards in the first year. I kept the house and enough to be comfortable and not $1 more, and I sleep better than I have since 2016. Now I want to spend the last part of this talking about what I actually learned, because if all you take from this is that an old man beat some thieves, then I have wasted your afternoon and mine. The first thing is about isolation, and it is the one I would put on a billboard if I could. Look at the sequence they used on me. It is not original. It is the oldest pattern there is, and it is being run on somebody's father or mother in every city in this country right now. First, arrive at the moment of maximum grief, not out of opportunism only, but because grief genuinely does impair judgment, and they know it. Second, redefine your exhaustion as your decline. You look tired became you are not well became legally, someone should be handling this. Third, cut your access, so that when you go to check something, you cannot, and the checking itself starts to look like paranoia. If you are over 65 and somebody who stands to gain from your incapacity is telling you that you seem confused, that is not concern. That is a construction project, and you are the foundation being undermined. And here is the cruel part. The correct response is the one that feels most wrong. It feels wrong to be suspicious of your own son. It feels ungenerous and small and like a betrayal of the love you have for him. So you swallow it. That swallowing is the whole mechanism. It is what they are counting on. Verification is not an accusation. I have said that sentence to myself 1,000 times since. Asking to see the account is not the same as saying you stole from it. If a person cannot tolerate being verified, that intolerance is itself the information. The second thing is about restraint, and it is the one I am proudest of, and I only figured it out by accident. There were at least 6 moments in this story where I could have exploded. In the lobby at 6 in the morning, in the cafeteria, on the phone, and every single time I did not, I gained something, not because silence is noble, but because silence is expensive for the other side. They cannot adjust to a man who does not react. Renee ran that entire operation on a model of me as a grieving old man, and I let her keep that model for 19 days, and the model is what destroyed her. Anger spent in public is anger wasted. Anger held is a tool, and the difference between a man who is a victim and a man who is dangerous is very often just the 90 seconds he did not fill with shouting. The third thing is the hardest, and I am still working on it. I lost my son on that Friday, but I did not lose him on that Friday. I lost him in 2007, in a room where a doctor told a 25-year-old man something devastating, and that man made a choice by himself, in private, with no one holding him, and then spent 19 years building a life on top of it that could not be examined. I have asked myself what I was doing in 2007. I know exactly what I was doing. I was building a terminal in Greensboro. I was working 80-hour weeks, and my son learned somewhere, from someone, that what our family valued was the appearance of success and the continuation of the line. And I have never been able to prove to myself that he learned that anywhere but from me. That does not excuse him. He was an adult, and he made his choices, and 140 people almost paid for them. But a man who tells you a story about betrayal, in which he himself is entirely blameless, is a man who has not finished thinking about it. The last thing is about what a family actually is. I spent 74 years believing it was blood, and I had a document in a safe that said so in legal language, and I would have defended that position at any dinner table in America. Then blood told me that a boy I taught to drive was nothing to me, and I found that I did not care what blood said. And paperwork told me that my son was entitled to everything, and I found that paperwork was not enough either. What was left when the blood and the paper were gone was this: Charlene in dispatch, 30 years. Ray Okonkwo, who drove to my house the week after the funeral with a pan of food and did not come in, just handed it over and left because he thought I might not want company. Elijah, who told me the option that would have made him less money. Dominic, who told me the answer I had not paid for. Eleanor, who is not here and is in every room. And a 19-year-old boy, not of my blood, who calls on Sundays and is bad at it and calls anyway. That is the ledger. Those are the entries that were real. Eleanor used to say that numbers on a screen are a rumor and numbers in ink are a fact. She was right, but she was talking about accounting, and it took me until 76 to understand the larger version of it. People will tell you who they are, in small entries, over years, in what they do on ordinary Tuesdays when nothing is at stake. Most of us are not reading the ledger. We are reading the name at the top of the page and assuming the columns underneath must add up. Read the columns, especially on the people you love, especially then. If this story meant something to you, if you have a parent you should check on, or a document you should read before you sign it, or a question you have been swallowing for years because asking felt disloyal, then subscribe to my channel and stay with me. I tell these stories because I lived one, and because the silence that protects the wrong people has to be broken by somebody. This story is drawn from lived experience and written entirely by hand, by a person over many drafts, in his own voice. Names, places, and identifying details have been changed to protect the innocent and the guilty alike, and some events have been compressed or reordered for clarity. The feelings are unchanged. What I got wrong honestly. This is my account, my memory, and my perspective, no one else's.